All right, let's dive in. Today, we're going to talk about a hidden cognitive skill that, honestly, shapes every single one of our interactions, from our closest friends to how whole societies work. It's all about the power of symbols and how getting a handle on them can, well, change pretty much everything.
You know that feeling, right? That totally frustrating moment when what you say or do or mean just gets completely twisted by someone else. We have all been there. And that universal experience, it points to a really fundamental challenge in how we all connect with each other.
And here's the problem in a nutshell. Take a simple symbol, like a white dress. In a lot of Western cultures, it screams purity, celebration, weddings. But in many Eastern cultures, it's a symbol of mourning. The exact same symbol holds completely opposite meanings, and that's the symbolic minefield we are navigating every single day.
That's because the world we live in is built on symbols. Think about it. Words, gestures, images, they're all just shortcuts for big, complex ideas. But, as we just saw, the instruction manual for what these symbols mean, it's definitely not universal. And that leaves the door wide open for constant misinterpretation.
So what if we could navigate this world a little better? What if there was some kind of cognitive superpower that could help us bridge these huge gaps in understanding? Well, that missing skill is exactly what we're digging into today: automated symbol mastery.
So what is it really? Automated symbol mastery, or ASM for short, is basically the ability to intuitively, almost automatically, get what symbols mean in different contexts. It's about being able to switch your mental framework on the fly, whether you're talking to someone from a different culture or maybe just someone whose brain is wired a bit differently than yours.
And this idea reframes the whole concept of bias in such a powerful way. It suggests that our biases aren't necessarily some deep character flaw, but more of a skill deficit, a kind of symbolic illiteracy. Maybe we just haven't learned to read other people's symbols correctly yet.
To really get this, let's use a simple analogy that I think makes it all click. Let's think about the entire world of human experience as just a giant collection of Legos. Every single thing you can think or feel. Love, fear, a complex scientific idea, a family tradition. Each one is a unique Lego block with its own special shape and color. And our minds use these blocks to build our entire understanding of reality.
Now, this is the really crucial part. What happens when we grow up only ever playing with the blocks from one specific Lego set? Well, we get really good at building with those pieces, but we start to assume they're the only pieces that even exist.
This is a perfect way to understand a huge problem in scientific research called weird bias. It's this tendency for psychology to be based mostly on people from Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies. It's basically the scientific version of studying only one box of Legos and then trying to write the instruction manual for all of humanity. It just doesn't work. And this is where that ASM superpower comes roaring in. It lets you see and appreciate all the different Lego sets out there. You start to understand how the unique blocks of neurodiverse thinkers fit into the bigger picture. You learn to build bigger, more inclusive worlds, because you recognize that every single person's set of blocks tells a complete and valid story. But hey, this isn't just a fun metaphor. This superpower is actually grounded in the biological wiring of our brains. It's powered by this fascinating little neural engine. It pretty much works like a three-step loop. First, your brain's visual center perceives a symbol. Second, a deep memory region processes it, basically asking, okay, what has this meant to me before? And finally, your brain's control tower, the prefrontal cortex, adapts that meaning to whatever's happening right now. It's this constant, dynamic process of figuring things out. This automatic, self-updating process is how our brain gets good at things. It's how we learn to tie our shoes or read a book without thinking about every single letter. The brain just runs these little feedback loops over and over and over until understanding becomes a reflex, not a slow, conscious thought.
So we've got the concept, we've got the Legos, and we've got the neuroscience. But why does any of this actually matter in the real world? Well, the stakes are incredibly high.
The difference is just so stark. Symbolic illiteracy, being stuck with only one Lego set, that leads to rigid thinking and biased assumptions. But symbol mastery, that fosters the exact opposite. Adaptive understanding, real empathy, and that deep connection that builds truly inclusive communities. The practical impact here is massive. We're talking about reducing that weird bias in science, which leads to better outcomes for everyone, not just one group. It's the real foundation of multicultural competence, turning vague ideas about diversity into the actual skills of listening and working together. It helps us better support neurodiverse people, like those with dyslexia, who are often total masters of visual symbolic thinking. And it lets therapists move beyond just assumptions to create truly effective and compassionate care.
And ultimately, the goal of building up this automated symbol mastery is, well, it's profound. It's about rewiring our brains and our societies to make respect for diversity as automatic, as unconscious, and as fundamental as taking a breath.
So I'll leave you with this one question to think about. When you encounter something or someone different, is your understanding a conscious reflection, or is it an empathetic reflex? The journey from one to the other, that's the path of symbol mastery. Thanks for exploring it with me.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a really powerful critique of modern therapy, and we're going to do it by looking at the secrets hidden inside a single, pretty unassuming number. Yeah, it's a journey that's going to connect computer science and human psychology in a way you probably didn't see coming.
So here it is, our central puzzle. And I know, it seems a little strange, right? What on earth can a number, 128, actually teach us about something as human as psychology? Well, as we're about to see, this number is kind of like a key. It helps us unlock a really fascinating critique of how we sometimes approach connection itself.
Okay, before we get to the number, we need to get on the same page about our core subject. You might have heard of this term, weird psychology. It's an acronym, and it refers to research and therapy that's mostly based on a very, very small and specific slice of the world's population. The critique we're looking at today argues that this narrow focus might be creating some serious, hidden problems.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the secret of 128 itself. Then we'll explore this whole argument through 4 really powerful analogies: the unbalanced midpoint, this idea of unshared responsibility, the problem of a rigid digital range, and something called a local host bias. And then at the end, we'll pull it all together to see the big picture. All right, let's dive in. So what's the core argument here? Well, it's the idea that certain therapeutic models, especially the ones coming out of these weird cultures, might have a kind of built-in symbolic deficit. You can think of it like a fundamental imbalance, almost like a blind spot in how they handle meaning and communication, especially with people who might see the world a little differently. So our first analogy for really getting our heads around this deficit comes from a totally different field: computer science and binary code. We're calling this one the unbalanced midpoint, and it's all about finding that critical balance point.
You know, the number 128 wasn't just picked at random. It's what's known as a power of 2, specifically 2 to the 7th power. And this mathematical property, it gives it a really special fundamental role in any binary system.
So for example, just think of a range of numbers from 0 to 255. That's super common in computing. The number 128 sits right smack in the middle. It's not just a number, it's a critical boundary, a balance point where things shift from one state over to another.
Okay, so here's where we make the jump from computer code to human cognition. If 128 is this critical boundary in a computer, then symbolically it represents that crucial and, let's be honest, often messy middle ground in human communication. It's that space where black and white thinking just stops and real nuance begins, which is pretty much the exact territory therapy is supposed to help us explore.
And this brings us to the crucial point of the critique. The argument goes that weird frameworks can be way too rigid right at this symbolic midpoint. They just don't handle ambiguity well. This forces something the source calls automated symbol mastery, or ASM. Now think of ASM as your brain's adaptive toolkit. It's all the constant mental work a person has to do to translate and make sense of a message that doesn't really fit their own cultural map. So in this model, the person from outside the dominant culture, their ASM is working overtime all the time just to bridge the gap.
So we've got this idea of a rigid system that forces one person to do all of the hard adaptive work. Now let's build on that with our next analogy, which explores how this imbalance creates what you could call unshared responsibility.
This time, our clue comes from a pretty special property of numbers. Now, I know the definition on screen sounds a bit complex, but the idea behind it is actually pretty simple. 128 is what's called a refactorable number. You can almost think of it like a perfectly organized team, where the number of jobs is perfectly divisible by the number of team members who can actually do the work. It implies this sort of natural, balanced give and take.
And this is a perfect metaphor for good communication. You see, just like that number has this balanced relationship with its parts, healthy communication requires that same dynamic reciprocity. It has to be a two-way street, where both the sender and the receiver share the responsibility for making sure the message actually gets across correctly.
But the problem kicks in when that responsibility isn't shared. This critique argues that weird frameworks often send out these culturally specific symbols and just expect them to be understood by everyone, without changing their own language. This puts the entire burden of figuring it all out on the receiver, creating what the source calls a deficit in symbolic co-responsibility.
Okay, so we've seen how this whole imbalance can lead to unshared responsibility. Our third way of looking at this, the rigid digital range, explores why the system can be so inflexible in the first place, and it uses the analogy of a simple computer byte. In hexadecimal code, which is just another way of representing numbers in computing, 128 is written as 0x80. And guess what? Once again, it's a critical midpoint. In an 8-bit byte, it's the threshold, that tipping point between what you might consider off and what you might consider on.
So this comparison suggests that symbolic understanding can have these rigid digital-like boundaries. The argument is that some weird models tend to define correct or normative ways of thinking within these very fixed bounds. Kind of like a digital system defines values as being on one side of the line or the other. There's really not much room for a middle ground. The result? You get a system that can be pretty brittle. By setting these hard limits on what's considered an acceptable interpretation, these frameworks really struggle with nuance, and that's exactly where flexible thinking is needed the most. And yet again, this forces that adaptive toolkit we talked about, the ASM, to do all the heavy lifting of navigating the full, messy, and ambiguous range of real human experience. And this brings us to our final and, maybe the most powerful analogy of them all. It really gets to the heart of this whole closed system problem. We're calling it a local host bias, and it comes straight from the world of computer networking. In the world of computer networking, the IP address 127.0.0.1 is pretty special. It doesn't point to some other computer out there on the internet. It always points back to itself. It's called the local host. And in simple terms, it just means me, or this computer right here.
And this quote from the source material absolutely nails the analogy. It reframes our individual perspectives, our cultural backgrounds, as our own unique network addresses. We each have our own internal network of symbols and meanings that we operate from. So, the local host deficit is what happens when one person assumes their own personal network address is the only one that matters, or the only one that's right. The critique suggests that weird therapy can operate with this local host bias, interpreting everything through its own internal cultural lens and basically failing to recognize that other people are operating from completely different symbolic networks with their own valid addresses. So, we've looked through these 4 different lenses: the unbalanced midpoint, the unshared responsibility, the rigid digital range, and the local host bias. So what is the larger picture here? What does this all really add up to?
Well, when you bring it all together, what you see is a critique of a systemic issue. The argument isn't just about an individual therapist's blind spot, but a structural problem that's kind of baked into the system itself. It points to a failure of shared symbolic responsibility, all driven by a closed local host mentality. And the result of all this is that it requires these constant forced acts of cognitive translation from anyone who happens to operate on a different symbolic network.
And this leaves us with one final, pretty provocative question. If a framework that's designed for human connection consistently forces those on the outside to do all of the adaptive work, is it truly connecting at all? It's a real challenge to rethink what it means to build systems that don't just communicate, but genuinely, truly share the weight of understanding. All right, let's dive right in. Today, we're talking about something huge: how we actually understand each other. And to do it, we're going to look at the human brain as, believe it or not, a giant, incredible Lego set.
Just picture it for a second. Your mind is filled with this totally unique collection of Legos you've been gathering your entire life. Every single experience, every conversation, every lesson, it's all given you different pieces. Some are simple, your basic red and blue blocks, but others are super complex and one of a kind. And you're using these blocks every moment of every day to build your reality.
So what are these Lego blocks really? They're symbols. A simple red brick might mean love to you, but to someone else, based on their life, it could mean danger or stop. Your brain is this master builder, constantly snapping these symbols together to make sense of everything. But, and this is a big but, what happens when the people who write the official instruction manual have only ever seen one kind of Lego set?
And that question, well, it leads us to a massive, massive problem in how we've tried to understand the human mind for a really long time.
This is exactly the issue that modern psychology is finally starting to tackle: For decades, the manual for how our minds work was written by, and mostly for, a very specific type of person who just kind of assumed their Lego set was the standard one for everybody.
And this problem has a name, the weird bias. It's an acronym, and it stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. Now, when the vast majority of what we know about psychology comes from weird societies, our understanding gets dangerously narrow. We end up with an instruction book that just doesn't work for most of the builders in the world.
Look, this isn't just a hunch. The data's pretty shocking. This table shows where our research, our instructions, is coming from. Just add up the studies from North America and Europe. You're talking thousands upon thousands. Now compare that to, say, Africa or South America. It's not even close. Our instruction manual is missing entire continents' worth of building techniques.
Let's just zoom in on one basic cognitive task, visual search, something we all do. We have over 4,000 studies combined from North America and Europe, and from the entire continent of Africa, 2. Just 2. This is what we mean by a one-sided instruction book. It's like trying to build a Lego model of the entire globe using only the pieces from a tiny box meant for one little house.
Okay, so that sounds pretty bad, right? A totally biased manual. How do we even begin to fix that? Well, here's the amazing part. It turns out our brains actually come with a built-in superpower designed to do exactly that.
So let's put these two things side by side. On one hand, you have the weird bias. It's a closed system, built on assumptions. It only recognizes the Lego blocks it already knows. But on the other side, we've got the brain's superpower, an open, adaptive system that can learn to see all the blocks. And we call it automated symbol mastery.
This is the hero of our story, folks, Automated Symbol Mastery, or ASM for short. Think of it as your brain's natural talent for looking at someone else's totally unique Lego creation, their thoughts, their culture, their feelings, and just getting it. You can see how they built it, even if you'd build it differently. It's basically the neuro engine for empathy.
And here's the crucial thing. This isn't a switch you just turn on and off. ASM is always working in the background. It's like this tireless little builder in your head that's constantly trying to figure out how to connect your Lego world with someone else's. It's always looking for a way to build a bridge.
So how on earth does this superpower actually work? What's going on in there? Let's pop the hood and take a look at the brain's master toolkit. Okay, think of your brain as having this incredible construction crew. You've got the MPFC, that's like the site foreman, the boss, figuring out what all the different Lego symbols mean. Then you've got parts that connect those pieces to your huge library of emotions and memories. You've also got the prefrontal cortex, which gives you the flexibility to rearrange the blocks when you get new information. And, to top it all off, your visual cortex helps you literally picture another person's Lego creation in your mind.
And this whole crew works together in a lightning-fast process called a mnemonic loop. Here's how it plays out. Imagine a sudden, loud bang. That's the input. Instantly, your brain processes it by zipping through every Lego block it has related to that sound. Fireworks, a car backfiring, danger, celebration. In a fraction of a second, it snaps together the most likely meaning to create an output, your unique personal reaction. And that reaction is built from your specific box of Legos.
You know, there's a line from the source material that just nails this perfectly. Someone whose life experiences have connected loud noises with trauma is going to build a very different startle reaction than someone who connects them with parties. Same input, totally different Lego build.
And this right here is why it all matters so much. When we use our automated symbol mastery, we're not just decoding what someone says or does. We're developing what's called symbolic empathy, the skill of actually seeing and respecting the unique, beautiful, and logical way that another person has built their world. So knowing we have this superpower is one thing, but how do we get better at it? How do we strengthen that muscle and become true master builders of understanding? Well, it really starts with being willing to admit that our own instruction manual might not be the complete story. From there, it's about getting curious. Genuinely curious. Ask people about their Lego blocks. Value their creations, especially when they look nothing like yours. And just practice, consciously practice, trying to see the world from where they're standing. It's a skill you build, brick by brick.
At the end of the day, the goal is to practice this so much that it becomes automatic. True mastery, true cultural competence, is when that respect and curiosity and empathy just becomes second nature, as automatic and unconscious as breathing. That's when you know you're a master builder.
And so that really leaves us with this final question.
When we all become master builders, skilled in understanding and appreciating each other's unique Lego sets, we don't just communicate better. We get the chance to build a better, more interesting, and more inclusive world together. So, what will you build?
Welcome to the debate.
Today we're tackling a really significant issue in psychological science, the generalizability crisis.
That's right. It stems from this heavy reliance on research participants from, well, what we call weird societies: Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And this isn't just some abstract concern, it's a measurable bias. We can see it using tools like structural topic modeling, and frankly, it hampers our ability to claim we understand human psychology universally.
Exactly. And that brings us to our central question for today. How do we fix this? Is the solution primarily a systemic imperative? Meaning, do we need massive, quantifiable changes in research itself, in the data we gather?
Or is it more of a neurocognitive imperative? Does the real solution lie with individual researchers and practitioners developing what the source material calls automated symbol mastery, or ASM, to actively counteract their own inherent weird deficits?
A really critical distinction. I'll be arguing that cultivating this neurocognitive skill, ASM, is actually the fundamental fix needed for truly adaptive understanding across cultures.
And I'll be taking the other side. While I agree individual skill is important, I think the sheer weight of evidence shows this is fundamentally a structural, a quantitative problem. Focusing too much on the individual risks ignoring or even excusing these deep systemic flaws. For me, systemic change driven by data has to come first. Okay, so from my perspective, the weird crisis really boils down to a failure in how we process symbols, a failure of cognitive reciprocity. You see, the weird framework gets automated in practitioners' minds, creating this sort of local host deficit. Think of it like your computer having an IP address set to 127.0.0.1. It can only talk to itself. It becomes self-referential, rigid.
The local host analogy. Right. And this automation, this bias, leads to real inflexibility when interpreting different perspectives. The solution then has to be automated symbol mastery, ASM. This isn't just learning about other cultures. It's about achieving an automatic, almost intuitive, recursive understanding of meaning across different cognitive and cultural systems. And crucially, this isn't pie-in-the-sky stuff. It seems to be rooted in our neurobiology. We're talking about brain regions like the medial prefrontal cortex, the MPFC, which handles self-reflection and interpreting symbols, working with the supramammillary nucleus, the SUM, which manages these iterative learning and memory loops. So achieving genuine cultural competence means making respect for diversity an automatic, deeply ingrained process. It's about automating symbolic empathy, if you will.
That's a compelling picture of the brain's potential. But I have to push back a bit. Framing this primarily as a symbolic or cognitive failure, I worry it sort of romanticizes the problem and maybe overlooks the stark, quantifiable structural failure in our data. The evidence we have from structural topic modeling, the STM data, it isn't just hinting at bias, it's screaming about catastrophic gaps.
But the structure is built by cognitions.
Hold on, let me give you the numbers. The geographic skew it's just devastating. For core cognitive tasks, look at the Stroop test, a classic task. North Central America, over 2,500 published abstracts. Africa, 37. Just 37. And for visual search tasks, even worse. Only 2 abstracts from Africa. I mean, this isn't a subtle symbolic nuance. It's like a whole continent's cognitive data is practically missing. It's a data extinction event, really. So prioritizing ASM feels like asking individuals, maybe especially neurodiverse people or those from non-weird backgrounds, to constantly perform this exhausting, forced act of compensation. They have to adapt to a system that structurally excludes their reality from the start. The priority has to be fixing the source. We need things like massively parallel sequencing, MPS, research programs, and we absolutely must expand topic modeling now to fix the data foundation, not just tweak the individual receiver.
Okay, the data point is stark. I grant you that. But
look,
I struggle to see how the failure isn't primarily structural when the system is literally starved of representative data. Let's talk about where the failure actually lies. The sources mention this deficit in symbolic co-responsibility, right? And they talk about midpoint rigidity in weird practitioners using the number 128 as a symbol for this inflexibility, something that could be refactored but isn't. The argument is that the system and the people in it fail to meet others halfway, interpretively speaking. Fine, but how can ASM possibly master symbols that are, for all practical purposes, absent from the research we rely on?
It's about the framework, but the framework is built on data. The STM analyses showed us quite clearly that the initial work on core cognitive tasks just didn't have quantifiable data. No thematic analysis for crucial marginalized groups. Think about sexual orientation. It wasn't represented in that specific data set. The weird deficit is a massive hole in the actual research record. So shouldn't we focus our energy on filling that hole with diverse quantified input through systemic change before we ask individuals to perform these neurocognitive gymnastics to grasp realities they have no data for?
I think you're slightly mistaking the symptom for the cause here. Yes, the geographic skew, the data scarcity, that's the evidence. It's the proof of the crisis. But the underlying mechanism, the thing that allowed the skew to happen and keeps it going, is the cognitive structure. It's that internal local host rigidity. I mean, imagine tomorrow we magically got all the funding we needed and filled every single data gap. A practitioner who is still operating from that fixed 127.0.0.1 cultural viewpoint, they're likely still going to interpret all that rich, new, complex data through their existing narrow automated lens. So ASM is needed to interpret even the existing symbolic representations more adaptively, especially when the data is biased or incomplete. If the weird framework automatically frames different ways of thinking as simple operational opposites, which the source says is a result of that midpoint rigidity, then just piling on more data won't automatically fix the interpretation. The brain itself needs retraining to move beyond that fixed binary. We know the brain can do this. The recursive loops involving the MPFC and some demonstrate this inherent capacity for adaptation. But it needs to be consciously nurtured, expanded, automated to overcome that ingrained ethnocentrism. So the structural problem, I argue, actually demands a neurocognitive solution to be truly resolved.
Okay, I understand the point about the brain's capacity, the MPFC and SUSAM showing potential for adaptation. But my deep concern remains the implication of forcing that adaptation onto certain groups. It feels like you're essentially placing the burden of compensation squarely on the shoulders of the marginalized, whether that's people from non-weird cultures or neurodiverse thinkers. They're the ones expected to constantly adjust to the rigidity of the dominant system.
Well, adaptation is learning.
But look at the analogy you used earlier, neurodiverse individuals, like dyslexic, 3D visual thinkers. Yes, they might develop alternative automation routes, like recursive spatial loops, to compensate for difficulties with standard phonological processing. It shows amazing ASM capacity, true. But isn't that compensation still a forced act? It's required because the system overwhelmingly prioritizes one kind of symbolic processing, phonological fluency, over others. So when we observe this forced accommodation, does it really prove the vitality of ASM? Or does it actually prove the rigidity, the failure of the symbolic sender, the weird system, the therapist operating within it? Shouldn't our goal be to eliminate the need for such strenuous compensation by reforming the system itself?
I see it differently. I don't think ASM is just compensation. I think it's the natural, necessary path to achieving genuine fluency in any new symbolic system. Think about learning a new language or a complex physical skill, or understanding a different cultural viewpoint. You have to go through that process of recursive automation, moving from conscious, clunky effort to smooth, automatic mastery. It's like a primitive, recursive second nature the brain possesses. So the neurodiversity example isn't just about a burden. It highlights that this powerful capacity for cross-symbolic mastery exists, and it's the very same capacity we need to cultivate to overcome cultural fixedness. If we see ASM as the route to fluent adaptive understanding, then prioritizing its development becomes essential. It's the difference, really, between just being aware of diversity on an intellectual level and making respect for it an automatic, fluent, embodied act of care.
I appreciate the reframing, moving ASM from burden to mastery, but I still maintain that our primary focus has to be on refactoring the system itself, that closed, local-hosted symbolic system. The rigidity you described, the $128 midpoint, the 127.0.0.1 deficit, these feel structural to me. And frankly, we need to move beyond these helpful but ultimately metaphorical descriptions and use our computational tools to actually fix the architecture. We should be aiming to replace these analogies with demonstrable, quantified models of the system.
How so?
Well, for instance, why not use something like graph theory? We could computationally model the connections or lack thereof between currently isolated cultural subnetworks within psychology's knowledge base. This kind of modeling could reveal the functional gaps, the bottlenecks, the places where the symbolic flow breaks down. Then we could target those structural weaknesses directly. Because if we don't fix the architecture, then all the individual mastery in the world, however fluent, might just end up being fluency within a fundamentally broken, segmented symbolic space.
That brings us neatly to the future research priorities, doesn't it?
It does, and the source material is quite explicit here. It identifies a critical goal. Future research must extend structural topic modeling analysis. We need to go beyond just basic cognitive tasks and apply it to abstracts covering social, personality, clinical psychology areas, highly relevant to historically marginalized groups, and, crucially, this has to include specific research quantifying the bias around sensitive areas like sexual orientation, where, as we noted, the thematic analysis in the published data is currently lacking. This kind of large-scale structural expansion of research feels absolutely non-negotiable. It's required to generate the diverse symbolic input that ASM would even need to work with across real-world cultural differences. Without that input data, the ASM's capacity remains largely theoretical. Wouldn't you agree?
I wholeheartedly agree that expanding STM is essential. It gives us the concrete evidence base we desperately need. But let me flip that slightly. Structural fixes create the opportunity for change, but it's cognitive mastery, ASM, that actually realizes that change in practice. We can't, I don't think, wait for every single data gap to be perfectly filled before we start training the very mechanism that interprets the data, however imperfect it might be initially.
So you're saying do both concurrently?
Exactly. Which means our concurrent research priority must be to operationalize ASM. We need to take it from a compelling theoretical concept and make it something we can actually measure in cognitive assessments, in cultural competence evaluations. We need to investigate its neural markers. What does successful ASM look like in the brain? The predicted outcome, perhaps linked to those massively parallel sequencing research programs you mentioned, is a quantifiable neural shift. That would mean measurable increases in brain plasticity, stronger, more efficient connectivity between the MPFC and SUM when a practitioner is successfully navigating culturally unfamiliar symbols. That functional neurobiological change, proving the brain has literally refactored its symbolic address space, that feels like the ultimate goal.
Structural data alone can't guarantee that internal shift, but the structural foundation has to come first, or at least be built much more robustly and rapidly. If the lived symbolic realities of huge populations are represented by just 2 abstracts, like that African visual search data point, then training the brain to be flexible is almost moot. The brain has nothing meaningful and representative to flex towards in the scientific record. You're advocating training a powerful interpretive muscle, but starving it of the diverse input it needs to develop properly. We risk just refactoring the symbolic address space to process the same old narrow, weird inputs, just maybe a bit more efficiently. The foundation must be built globally, quantitatively, urgently.
Well, at the end of the day, the material clearly lays out 2 imperatives that we can't ignore. My position stresses that the path to truly inclusive, adaptive psychological science requires us to prioritize cultivating automated symbol mastery. It's about demanding that practitioners actively internalize and automate a flexible symbolic system, making deep respect for diversity an automatic embodied act of care, something potentially measurable in brain function.
And I maintain that without first confronting the stark,
quantitative evidence of the weird crisis, those data extinction events that prove the system is failing, and without committing fully to large-scale structural research expansion, like MPS and extending STM comprehensively, the symbolic realities of diverse peoples will simply remain marginalized footnotes in our science. We absolutely have to fix the rigid, data-starved, local-hosted system itself to give meaning and purpose to the individual mastery you champion.
It's clear from the sources that genuine competence and truth in psychological science demand both this radical cognitive flexibility we've discussed
And an undeniable, profound systemic correction. The debate really continues on the precise balance, the weighting, and maybe the sequencing of these two crucial elements.
Indeed. Lots more to explore there.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're really tackling something foundational. We're going deep into what feels like a crisis in psychological knowledge itself. We're challenging the very bedrock of how researchers understand human behavior, how they measure it, and maybe most importantly, how they apply it. And this isn't just about looking at a few studies. We're tracing a line from some pretty stark statistical bias right down to, believe it or not, the wiring inside your brain.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah, our mission today is to kind of distill a set of sources that do two really critical things, and they're interwoven. First, they lay out the quantitative proof, the actual numbers for a huge systemic problem in psychology, a really deep bias in who gets studied. And second, they introduce a pretty sophisticated, maybe even radical neurocognitive solution. It's a framework designed not just to paper over the cracks, but to potentially fix the bias structurally, right at the level of brain processing.
Okay, let's nail down those two core ideas right away, because you really need to grasp the problem to see why the fix is so, necessary. The problem, as these sources define it, is the weird bias. And the proposed fix is something called automated symbol mastery, or ASM.
Right. So WEIRD. It's an acronym. It stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. The weird problem is basically that psychology, historically, has overwhelmingly relied on research participants from this very specific, very small slice of humanity.
And this isn't just like a minor sampling error that statisticians worry about, is it? The consequences are bigger.
Oh, much bigger. Far bigger. This extreme focus, the skew, leads directly to huge problems with generalizability. Can we apply these findings globally? Often the answer is no, or at least we can't assume we can. And maybe more critically, it trains researchers and practitioners, think therapists, educators, to develop these automated, often culturally insensitive assumptions because they assume their weird-derived findings are universal human truths.
Right. So if your training is almost entirely based on data from, say, North American university students, your internal baseline for normal thinking or healthy coping is already tilted. And crucially, it's automatic. You don't consciously think, is this weird? It's just how you see things.
Exactly. That automation is the real kicker. It makes the bias incredibly hard to fix with just, awareness training or cultural sensitivity workshops. Those things are important, but they rely on conscious effort, which is slow and resource intensive. ASM Automated Symbol Mastery is presented as the antidote because it targets that automation. It's defined as the ability to automatically and recursively master symbolic meaning across different cognitive styles, across different cultures.
So it's moving beyond that deliberate, effortful check, wait, is this a cultural thing, to actually having diverse ways of understanding built into your brain's default processing, faster, more intuitive, and this really matters to you, the listener, right? Whether you're a professional in the field or just someone trying to navigate our incredibly diverse world.
Absolutely. This isn't just some academic debate tucked away in journal articles. This framework is trying to pinpoint the core cognitive mechanism you need for genuine, ethical, cultural competence. It's tackling the ethical need to prevent harm. Harm that comes from applying these ethnocentric, automated assumptions in really high-stakes areas. Therapy, definitely. But also education, policymaking, even international relations. Misinterpreting symbols automatically can lead to real damage, systemic harm.
Yeah, it reframes cultural competence. It's not just a list of don'ts. ASM tries to ground that ethical goal in something concrete, measurable in our neurobiology.
Exactly. And people have been pointing out the field's lack of diversity and universality issues for decades, ethically. But what these sources really try to do is quantify it. They move the argument from this is wrong to here are the numbers showing how wrong and where it's wrong.
Which brings us to the quantitative proof, because vague feelings about bias aren't enough. The sources talk about researchers using a specific technique, right? Structural topic modeling, or STM.
Yes, STM. It's a powerful form of text mining. They applied to thousands and thousands of published psychology abstracts. The goal was to prove the bias numerically and uncover hidden patterns, structural trends that you wouldn't see otherwise.
How does STM work differently than just, say, counting keywords? If I search for memory in abstracts, doesn't that tell me something?
It tells you something, but STM is much more sophisticated. It doesn't just count words in isolation. It looks at how words consistently co-occur within documents. It identifies clusters of words that represent underlying coherent topics.
Okay, so it's like seeing Apple appear often isn't the point. It's seeing that in one set of papers, Apple frequently appears with reaction time, screen, and task, suggesting a topic like basic cognitive experiment. But in another set, Apple might appear with child, anxiety, and intervention, suggesting a topic like clinical child psychology.
Precisely. STM uncovers those implicit thematic contexts that simple word counting misses entirely. This allowed the researchers to map out the structural biases in what kind of research is actually getting done and where. They focused this analysis on abstracts related to two really fundamental cognitive tasks, ones used everywhere in psychology. The Stroop test.
The color word interference.
That's the one. And visual search tasks, finding a target among distractors. These are like the bedrock tasks for studying attention, control, processing speed.
And the amount of data they crunched was huge, right?
Massive. For the Stroop test, 7,508 abstracts. For visual search, 5,408 abstracts, spanning decades of published research. This provides a really robust picture. And when they map the geographic origin of these studies based on the first author's institution, well, the skew becomes undeniable.
Let's see the numbers. Where is this core knowledge coming from?
Okay, so North Central America, primarily the U.S. and Canada, accounted for 2,551 Stroop abstracts and 2,245 visual search abstracts. Europe was very similar. 3,073 Stroop, 2,274 visual search. Just those two regions dominate the landscape. They are the engine of this foundational cognitive science.
Right, the vast majority. Then what happened?
Then it drops off dramatically. Asia contributed 1,389 Stroop and 632 visual search abstracts. Still significant, but a clear step down. South America. The numbers plummet. 201 Stroop abstracts and only 33 visual search abstract.
30 abstracts for visual search from an entire continent? That's already concerning. But then there's Africa.
And this is the figure that really crystallizes the crisis. From the entire continent of Africa, the analysis found only 37 Stroop abstracts. And for visual search, just two. Yeah. 2 abstracts in the entire data set of over 5,400.
2 out of 5,408. It's hard to even process that number statistically. It basically means that for a fundamental cognitive process like visual search, the scientific contribution, or at least the representation in mainstream journals, from Africa is practically zero.
It's statistical invisibility. And the implication is profound. If you're a clinician or a researcher trying to apply a model of attention based on those thousands of North American and European studies to someone in, say, Nigeria or Kenya, you're flying completely blind. You have almost no foundational data specific to that context.
The assumption of universality is built on sand, or rather built on very specific, geographically limited soil.
Exactly. The lack of data from regions like Africa, South America, much of Asia, means any claim of global applicability for theories derived mainly from weird samples is, frankly, unsupported. It carries a huge risk of error, misdiagnosis, inappropriate interventions. The knowledge map is fundamentally broken.
And the STM didn't just show where the research comes from, but also what kind of research, right? The topics themselves differed.
Yes, and this is fascinating. STM revealed that even when using the same tasks, Stroop, visual search, the focus of the research varied significantly by region. Keywords like attention might be everywhere, but the context changed. For example, topics related to basic research, the real fundamental mechanism studies, the how does this cognitive process work? Questions were disproportionately concentrated in North Central America. You saw word clusters like word, color, effect, task-dominating Stroop research there.
Suggesting a focus on lab-based experimental psychology, understanding the nuts and bolts. What about Europe?
Europe showed a consistently higher concentration of clinical research topics, applying these cognitive tasks to understand or assess patient populations. The dominant word clusters there included things like patient, depressed, schizophrenia, disorder, and this held true for both Stroop and visual search studies.
Wow. So it's not just that the participants are weird, but the actual questions being prioritized are regionally biased too. North America is asking, how does the brain do X? Europe is asking, how does X go wrong in these clinical groups?
Precisely. It shows that psychological science isn't some monolithic, universal endeavor. Research priorities are shaped by local factors, funding agencies, healthcare systems, historical academic traditions. So, a clinician in the U.S. might be drawing heavily on basic mechanism findings, while one in Germany might be more focused on clinical application studies. They're operating in somewhat different scientific ecosystems, both built on that same limited weird foundation.
Did the analysis show any changes over time? Like, is the field getting broader?
There was a general trend, yes. Topics related to neuroscience, brain imaging, EEG, that sort of thing, generally increased across the board over the publication years for both tasks, which makes sense given the rise of neuroimaging technologies.
But was that trend everywhere? Did it change the fundamental focus?
Interestingly, not uniformly. The sources noted that in some very high-impact general psychology journals like Psychological Science, while there was an increase in cultural and social psychology topics over time, which is good news, the proportion of neuroscience topics didn't actually increase in that specific influential journal. This suggests the overall neuroscience boom might be driven more by the growth of specialized neuroscience journals rather than a fundamental shift within the core general psychology outlets. The cultural representation gap seems to persist, even as brain measuring tools get better.
Okay, that quantitative evidence is incredibly compelling. It paints a picture of a science that's geographically and topically skewed. The map is broken. But now we need to understand how this broken map functions inside the mind of, say, a weird therapist. We need to shift from the stats to the conceptual model of the problem.
Exactly. The sources argue the problem isn't just numbers, it's structural. It's like a flaw in the cognitive software, a rigid, closed network protocol running in the practitioner's symbolic processing system. And they use some really interesting abstract analogies, mathematical networking concepts to model this weird symbolic deficit.
Let's unpack those. The first one is midpoint rigidity, using the number 128. Why 128? What does that have to do with cultural bias?
Okay, so 128 isn't arbitrary. In computing, especially in 8-bit systems, 128 or $207 hexadecimal, 7 by $80 one is the exact midpoint. It splits the range of possible values 0 to 255 in half. Metaphorically, this midpoint represents a critical threshold. It's the point where meaning often shifts, becomes ambiguous, or flips to its perceived opposite. Think of it like a very simplistic dividing line.
Like the line between normal and abnormal in a very binary system.
Precisely. The argument is that weird therapeutic frameworks often operate within this midpoint rigid system. Their internal dictionary of acceptable behavior, emotion, identity, their symbolic address space is closed off and self-referential. It's rigidly structured around common weird cultural binaries. Normal, abnormal, rational, emotional, independent.
And this rigidity means they have trouble with anything near that midpoint, anything ambiguous.
Exactly. They struggle near that 7 by $80 threshold, the gray areas where context should define meaning. So if a client from a non-weird background expresses grief in a way that falls slightly outside the therapist's narrow acceptable range, say it's coded as a 135 on that 0 to 235 scale, the rigid system doesn't see nuance. It snaps to the other side of the midpoint, coding it as abnormal or pathological, maybe 255.
I see. It doesn't register the subtle difference at 135. It jumps straight to the extreme opposite because it only recognizes the 0128 box as okay.
Right. And that inability to process nuance, that structural rigidity around the midpoint, is a major cognitive failure. The proposed fix, ASM, needs to operate flexibly across that entire range. It needs to recursively recalibrate meaning, recognizing 135, 140, 150 as distinct points, not just lumping everything beyond 128 into one abnormal category.
That idea of a closed, self-referential system leads perfectly into the next analogy. The local host deficit, $127.11. This one uses a networking term.
Yeah, it's a great metaphor. In computer networking, the IP address $127.112 always refers to localhost. It means this computer itself. Any data sent to that address just loops back internally. It never goes out onto the network. It's a completely self-contained communication loop.
So how does that apply to a weird practitioner's mind?
The argument is they often operate with this localhost deficit or bias. They encounter a client's symbol, maybe it's a specific metaphor they use, a family structure, a way of expressing respect, and they interpret that symbol only through their own internal weird cultural lens. Their interpretive process is stuck on localhost.
They're essentially running their cultural software in a closed loop, failing to recognize that the client might be transmitting signals from a completely different network address, using a different symbolic protocol that requires translation or negotiation.
Exactly. The therapist system defaults to its own internal operating system as the universal standard. It doesn't automatically try to connect to or decode the client's potentially different symbolic network. It assumes its local setup is the only one that matters.
And there's a third mathematical concept used to model this deficit, the failure of refactorability, linked back to that number 128. This sounds complex.
It's a bit abstract, but the core idea is about shared responsibility. The number 128 is mathematically refactorable because it's divisible by the count of its own divisors. It has 8 divisors, including 1 and a 128, but the source material mentions 7, perhaps excluding 1 or 128, or focusing on factors other than 1 in itself. The specific mathematical detail isn't the main point as much as the concept. This mathematical property symbolizes reciprocity. In an ideal communication like therapy, both parties, sender and receiver, therapist and client, should share the work of interpretation. The system should be flexible, open to being refactored or reorganized based on the interaction.
But the weird system, being rigid and local host bound, fails this test of flexibility.
Precisely. The weird deficit represents a failure to engage in this reciprocal flexibility. The dominant cultural framework imposes its symbolic norms, expecting the other party to do all the adaptive work. This creates a deficit in symbolic co-responsibility. The sender, the weird system, refuses to adjust its transmission protocols.
So putting these 3 models together, the midpoint rigidity, the local host deficit, the failure of refactorability, paints a picture of a system that's closed, inflexible, and non-reciprocal. And the irony then is that any successful communication across this divide forces the other person, the client, the non-weird individual, to do all the heavy lifting.
That's the profound implication. Their brain is forced into performing constant, effortful, recursive translation. They have to filter their experience through the narrow bandwidth of the dominant local host system just to be understood. It's exhausting neurocognitive labor. ASM, as an automatic capacity, is proposed as the adaptive process that should be happening, compensating for the system's rigidity, but ideally it shouldn't just be the marginalized person doing it.
That really shifts the focus of the problem. It's not about fixing the individual, it's about fixing the systemic cognitive rigidity. Okay, let's pivot fully to the solution now. Automated symbol mastery, ASM. How do we get from that broken model to something fluid and empathetic?
So ASM is defined as this intuitive, context-sensitive ability. It's about recognizing complex symbols, could be words, gestures, stories, social structures, emotional cues, and being able to map their meaning adaptively as the context shifts. It's moving beyond just knowing about cultural differences to achieving genuine cognitive fluency.
And the key is that this fluency isn't just learned knowledge, it requires practiced, recursive mental processes to become automatic.
Yes, recursive and practiced are crucial. It's about building loops in the brain that constantly refine understanding based on feedback. This is the opposite of symbolic illiteracy or the rigid, one-size-fits-all interpretation seen in the weird deficit. ASM isn't just an end goal, it's conceptualized as a logical, continuous compensatory mechanism. It's the brain actively, constantly working to bridge those gaps between different symbolic systems.
And this compensation is needed because, like we saw with midpoint rigidity, the weird default often misinterprets difference as opposition or deficit, right? ASM forces the brain to see nuance instead.
Exactly. And we actually see the brain's amazing capacity for building these kinds of compensatory systems in neurodiversity. The sources bring up the example of dyslexia, especially in people who are strong 3D visual thinkers. Their brains often build a form of ASM out of necessity.
How so? If their challenge is with automating phonological processing, sounding out words quickly, how does the brain compensate?
It often develops incredibly strong recursive spatial loops using the visual spatial parts of the brain. Instead of just processing words as linear sounds or text, they translate abstract language, which is difficult for them to automate linguistically, into vivid, dynamic, three-dimensional mental imagery. They essentially build a powerful, alternative, symbolic processing pathway.
So they're automatically turning the world's flat, abstract symbols into something richer, more spatial, more intuitive for them. It becomes a kind of primitive, recursive second nature, that continuous automatic translation loop. That's a fantastic example of ASM in action.
It really is. It shows us that recursion, that self-referential processing loop, is the engine that drives mastery and adaptation. The idea behind ASM training would be to try and cultivate similar recursive flexibility in culturally rigid thinking patterns.
Can we apply this ASM idea to something more basic, like a physiological response? The sources mention the startle effect, how we react to a sudden loud noise.
Yes, a purely weird or overly simplistic biological view might just measure the magnitude of the startle reflex and generalize its meaning, big startle equals high anxiety. But an ASM-informed perspective recognizes that the meaning the brain assigns to that startle and the resulting behavioral response is deeply context-dependent. It's shaped by individual brain blocks, the person's unique internal library of symbols related to safety, threat of memory, past experiences.
So a large startle response in someone from a conflict zone might not just be high anxiety in a pathological sense, but a highly learned, adaptive, and maybe even compensated survival mechanism built from their specific symbolic environment of threat.
Exactly. ASM allows a practitioner to see and respect those unique symbolic constructions. Instead of imposing a universal meaning onto the biological response, they inquire into its specific meaning for that individual within their context. Cultivating ASM, then, is about building and strengthening those recursive, auto-interpretive loops in the brain. Moving from consciously trying to be sensitive to having symbolic empathy become more automatic, more deeply ingrained.
Okay, this leads us straight into the neuroscience. If ASM is a real cognitive fix, it needs to have a basis in brain structures and functions. We can't just talk about fluency. We need to know where this happens.
Right. The sources propose that ASM isn't just one spot in the brain, but relies on a network of key regions working together. And critically, it's the connectivity between these regions that seems to mark the difference between rigid thinking and adaptive mastery.
Let's break down the key players. First, the medial prefrontal cortex, or MPFC. What's its role?
The MPFC is like the brain's executive hub for this kind of high-level interpretation. It's crucial for integrating incoming information, like observing a client's behavior with existing memories, context, and importantly, emotional significance or valence. For ASM, the MPFC is thought to drive the complex, self-aware process needed to recognize symbolic ambiguity and flexibly update interpretations. It's where you consciously realize, this symbol might mean something different here.
So the MPFC flags the ambiguity. But conscious awareness is slow, like we said. What helps turn that conscious recognition into something faster, more automatic, more embedded?
That's where a deeper brain structure, the supramammillary nucleus, or SUM, is proposed to play a vital role. It's heavily involved in regulating things like memory consolidation and emotional learning, often through iterative looping processes. In the context of ASM, the SUM is thought to facilitate those crucial recursive loops. It helps to stabilize a new symbolic meaning over time, integrating it with emotional context and ensuring it remains accessible and relevant, rather than the brain just reverting to its old, rigid default interpretation.
Okay, so if a therapist encounters a novel cultural symbol, the MPFC might consciously process it initially. But it's the interaction with the SUM that potentially helps embed that new understanding into the automatic emotional memory system, making the flexible interpretation stick.
That seems to be the hypothesis. That's why the sources really emphasize that achieving true automated symbol mastery wouldn't just be about MPFC activity alone. The crucial marker would be measurably stronger functional connectivity between the MPFC and the SUM. That enhanced connection would represent the learned automated pathway. Weak connectivity might signify symbolic instability.
And what would symbolic instability feel like or look like in practice?
It might mean the therapist intellectually knows that, say, a client's indirect communication style is culturally appropriate, but their gut-level automatic emotional reaction, driven by the old weird symbolic programming, still interprets it negatively, perhaps as avoidance or dishonesty. The intellectual understanding and the automatic emotional response aren't aligned because the SUM hasn't effectively stabilized the new symbolic mapping. The meaning flickers, it's unstable.
Makes sense. And there was a third brain region mentioned, the visual cortex.
Yes, playing more of a supporting role, but potentially crucial, especially linking back to that dyslexia example. The visual cortex underpins mental imagery and spatial processing. For individuals who compensate visually, or even just for processing nonverbal symbols or complex spatial metaphors across cultures, the visual cortex could be providing an alternative, powerful route for achieving that automatic, symbolic understanding, feeding into the MPFC for interpretation.
So when this network MPFC, SOM, maybe supported by the visual cortex, is working well together with strong connections and continuous updating loops, the sources call that state harmonious recursion.
Exactly. That's the ideal state, where the brain is fluidly, automatically self-updating its symbolic interpretations based on context and experience, without conscious overload. Symbolic mastery becomes second nature. Conversely, a failure in this recursive automation weak connectivity, rigid loops, leads to the cognitive inflexibility, the difficulty switching perspectives, the impaired empathy that characterizes the weird deficit. The automatic decoding system just isn't incorporating diverse meanings effectively.
Okay, we've covered the proof of the problem, the model of the cognitive failure, and the proposed neural fix. Let's zoom out again to the broader implications. What does this all mean systemically?
Well, the most direct implication of the quantitative bias data is stark. Any population significantly underrepresented in the foundational research, which is most of the world, is inherently vulnerable to having potentially biased or inappropriate science applied to them. It's an ongoing ethical and empirical crisis. If you're not in the data, the models might actively harm you.
And this invisibility, this lack of data, extends even to groups within weird societies that the field acknowledges need specific attention, right? You mentioned the analysis didn't find specific topics related to sexual orientation in those core cognitive tasks.
That's correct. Despite psychology as a field stressing the importance of understanding diverse sexual orientations and gender identities and the known risks of bias, the foundational STM analysis of Stroop and visual search abstracts found no distinct thematic clusters or specific quantitative data related to sexual orientation.
That's a huge gap. It means that even when trying to understand basic cognitive functions, attention, inhibition in LGBTQ+ individuals, practitioners are likely drawing on models that never specifically included or considered their unique experiences or symbolic realities.
Exactly. It confirms that their realities remain statistically marginalized in the very bedrock cognitive science literature. This practically guarantees that the local host deficit is operating when practitioners encounter symbolic aspects related to gender or sexuality that differ from the assumed weird norm.
So, to truly address these deep systemic gaps and validate the ASM model, the sources propose something ambitious, a massively parallel sequencing MPS research program, like a human genome project, but for cultural cognition.
Yeah, it's framed as a moonshot-level project. The idea is that to move ASM from a compelling theory to a verifiable, applicable science, you need data on an unprecedented scale. You need to map the neural circuitry of symbolic processing across global populations.
What would that actually involve? What are the key components of this MPS vision?
Two main things. First, multimodal neural sequencing. This means using complementary brain imaging tools like fMRI for good spatial maps of where activity happens, and EEG for precise timing of when it happens to map that MPFC sum circuit and its interaction with other areas, like the visual cortex. And critically, doing this across thousands of participants globally, representing genuine human diversity, while they engage with culturally relevant symbolic tasks. We're sequencing patterns of brain activity and connectivity, not DNA.
Sequencing brain function in response to symbols globally, that's massive. What's the second component?
Second, you need proof that this circuitry is actually trainable, that ASM can be cultivated. That requires longitudinal differential expression analysis. Basically, you track individuals, maybe therapists in training over time. You'd implement targeted cultural ASM training programs, interventions designed to build that recursive symbolic flexibility. Then you'd measure their brain activity and connectivity before, during, and after the training to see if it changes in the predicted ways when they encounter challenging cross-cultural scenarios.
And the ultimate proof, the holy grail for this MPS program, would be what specific neural change?
The gold standard validation would be demonstrating a measurable structural neural shift. Specifically, after successful ASM training, you should see significantly stronger functional connectivity between the MPFC and the sum when those individuals process novel or ambiguous cultural symbols compared to their pre-training baseline.
Showing that their brain's default network for handling symbolic difference has literally been rewired, strengthened.
Exactly. It would be empirical evidence that their brain has refactored its symbolic address space. They've moved demonstrably beyond the rigid local host limitations of the weird bias towards a more open, adaptive, recursive neural architecture for understanding others.
This whole framework, it really shifts the conversation. It makes cultural competence not just an ethical ideal, but a potentially measurable, trainable neurocognitive skill. It's a call to move from psychology's narrow, midpoint, rigid defaults to something far more dynamic and inclusive, ideally becoming automatic.
Yes, ASM is fundamentally an ethical call to action, grounded in neuroscience. It demands that the burden of adaptation shifts. Stop forcing marginalized individuals to do all the translation work and instead require the dominant systems and the individuals within them to build the necessary neurocognitive flexibility themselves.
So wrapping up this deep dive, we've journeyed from that stark quantitative proof of bias, remember, those two abstracts from Africa, through a conceptual model of the cognitive failure, the local host deficit, and landed on the specific neural machinery, especially that MPFC sum connection proposed for the fix for automated symbol mastery.
And throughout, we've seen how the current weird system's rigidity forces an immense, often invisible cognitive load onto clients, patients, neurodiverse individuals, anyone outside that narrow norm. They're constantly translating, compensating, using precious neural resources just to bridge the symbolic gap created by the system's inflexibility.
Which brings us to our final thought for you, the listener, something to really chew on. If this model is right, if automated symbol mastery is a trainable neurocognitive skill, if we can scientifically measure and encourage the brain to refactor its symbolic address space, imagine the cognitive and emotional energy that could be freed up globally. How much human potential is currently wasted on forced translation that could be unleashed if the dominant weird systems finally learn to automatically compensate for and truly value the full spectrum of human symbolic experience.
Today, we're going to do something kind of cool. We're going to connect a surprisingly lucky number to a really fascinating scientific concept. This is all about the hidden codes that exist in our culture, and yeah, even inside our own minds. All right, take a look. The number 228. At first glance, it probably looks like any other number, right? But stick with me here, because this number holds a pretty remarkable set of meanings that actually bridge ancient beliefs with modern science. So, what if I told you this number, 228, was more than just a bunch of digits? What if it was a key? A kind of symbol that could unlock a concept as powerful as easy fortune. Let's dive in. So where does this whole easy fortune thing come from? Well, its most direct meaning comes from Cantonese numerology. See, in Cantonese, when you say 228, it sounds almost exactly like the phrase for easy fortune or easy prosperity. It's a number that just radiates this vibe of good luck and balance. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, the story doesn't stop there, not by a long shot. The symbolic power of this number pops up in other belief systems too, and each one adds another fascinating layer to its meaning. Okay, so let's actually put these different meanings side by side. We're going to look at 3 totally distinct cultural takes on this number, and I think you're going to start to see a really cool pattern emerge. Okay, so you've got Cantonese, right? Easy fortune, pretty straightforward. Then you jump over to the world of angel numbers, and suddenly 228 is all about abundance and harmony, that feeling of your inner and outer worlds being in sync. And get this, in Hebrew roots, the number is connected to the whole idea of prevailing, of being strong, of being resilient. You starting to see the themes here? Prosperity, harmony, strength? So you see the pattern, right? It's these 3 common threads that keep popping up. Across these totally different systems, 228 consistently points to prosperity, a sense of balance, and this deep underlying resilience. It's a number that seems to symbolize not just getting lucky, but truly thriving. Okay, so ancient symbolism, lucky numbers. What in the world does any of this have to do with something as modern and, let's be honest, as complex as neurosymbolic science? It feels like a massive leap, but you'd be surprised at how direct the connection really is. This is where we get to the heart of it. We're about to pull back the curtain on the scientific framework that, as it turns out, is almost perfectly described by the symbolism we've just been unpacking. All right, say hello to Automated Symbol Mastery, or ASM for short. Now, the academic definition is a neurosymbolic framework that explains how we adapt and master meaning, which, is just a fancy way of talking about how our brains process, adapt to, and eventually get really good at understanding all the complex symbols and meanings that surround us every single day. So, in plain English, it's basically about how our brains get super, super good at automatically figuring out things like jokes, sarcasm, or cultural references. That's your brain mastering symbols. ASM is the theory that explains how we get so good at it that it becomes fluid, automatic. You don't even have to think about it. And here it is. This is the big connection, that aha moment. Those 3 themes we talked about from the number 228, easy fortune, balance, and strength, turns out they're not just random poetic ideas. They are perfect metaphors for the core functions of automated symbol mastery. Okay, let's start with easy fortune. Think about it. What does that really mean? It's about things just clicking, right? Effortless success. Well, in the world of ASM, that's the end game. It's that effortless, fluid mastery of meaning where understanding the world around you becomes so automatic it feels like a fortunate gift. All right, next up, balance and harmony. Our brains are constantly juggling conflicting ideas, different cultural signals. ASM is the name for that mental process our mind uses to negotiate all those inputs, to find a dynamic balance and create a coherent picture of the world. It really is a cognitive balancing act. And last but not least, strength and prevailing. This is so important. ASM isn't just about your brain passively soaking things up. No way. It's an active, adaptive process. It's the cognitive muscle that allows us to overcome misunderstandings, to adapt to new environments, and to fill in the gaps in our knowledge. It is, literally, how our minds prevail. So you see, this isn't just a fun coincidence. The symbolism of 228 is actually a powerful and, honestly, a really elegant metaphor for how this whole complex scientific framework operates. It gives us a handle on it. Okay, let's pull back for a second. So what? Why does this connection between a lucky number and a complex science thing, why does it actually matter? What does it really tell us? Well, it matters because it reminds us that our brains are fundamentally wired to find meaning, sometimes in the most unexpected places. It shows that science doesn't have to live in a vacuum. It can be richer and more intuitive when it embraces cultural symbols. And maybe most importantly, it's a perfect example of how a powerful metaphor can make a really complex idea accessible to just about anyone. There's a quote from the source material that just nails it. Embrace symbolic plurality as a source of strength. Instead of seeing different ways of thinking, like science and numerology, as being totally separate, we can see that when you bring them together, that plurality becomes a real source of intellectual and adaptive strength. And that really leaves us with one last huge question to chew on, right? If a simple number like 228 can hold a key to understanding a complex cognitive process, what other hidden codes, symbols, and meanings are out there quietly shaping our science, our culture, and our very own minds?
So what if I told you that a lucky number, one from Cantonese culture, actually holds a key to fixing a huge fundamental flaw in modern psychology? It sounds kind of wild, right? Well, today, we're going to decode this incredible link between a piece of cultural wisdom and a truly cutting-edge theory about how our minds work.
Okay, let's just dive right in. We're about to unravel a puzzle that connects the symbolism of something called easy fortune directly to a crisis that's been quietly shaking the foundations of psychology for years.
All right, so our story begins with this major glitch in how we've been studying the human brain for decades. It's a problem so big, it's actually got its own catchy acronym, WEIRD.
Now, for the longest time, the science of the human mind has been built on this tiny, and I mean tiny, unrepresentative slice of humanity. So what does that mean? It means our most basic theories about how we think and feel, they might not even apply to most people on the planet.
And you don't have to take my word for it. The data here really screams it. I mean, just look at these numbers for some core cognitive research. For studies on something as basic as visual search, you've got over 2,000 studies from North America and Europe. And just two from the entire continent of Africa. The bias is absolutely staggering.
And let's be clear, this isn't just some dusty academic debate. This has real-world consequences. We're talking about flawed therapies, theories that don't work globally, and this one-size-fits-all approach to mental health that, frankly, flat out fails for the majority of the world.
So, if our science has this massive glitch, where do we even start to look for a fix? Well, it turns out the solution might actually be hardwired directly into our own brains.
So researchers have come up with this really powerful idea called automated symbol mastery, or just ASM. You can think of it as your brain's own built-in superpower to become fluent in different symbolic worlds. It's what allows us to understand that a word, a symbol, a gesture can mean completely different things in different places. It's like having this constant subconscious translation service running in your head. You know how a thumbs-up gesture means great in one culture, but it's deeply offensive in another? Well, that little cognitive switch that happens in your brain that helps you navigate that, that's ASM at work. It's always there, bridging the gaps between one culture's assumptions and another's reality. Now, to really get a grip on just how limiting this weird framework is, researchers did something pretty cool. They basically translated this psychological bias into the language of computer science. They turned it into code. Okay, first, let's look at the number 128. In a lot of computer systems, 128 acts as a kind of rigid boundary, a midpoint. And in this analogy, it's the perfect symbol for the weird bias.
It represents this closed-off, black-and-white thinking that just really struggles with any kind of cultural nuance.
And that rigidity leads to what they call the localhost deficit. So in the tech world, the IP address 127.0.0.1 is, well, it's how a computer talks to itself. It's a completely closed loop. And that right there is the weird bias in a nutshell, a way of thinking that only references its own internal culture, failing to ever connect to the global network of human experience.
So this brings us to the core challenge, doesn't it? If our scientific models are basically stuck in this closed loop, trapped at this rigid midpoint of 128, how in the world do we break out? Where's the path forward?
And this is where the story takes a fascinating turn. Because the answer, or at least a powerful symbol for it, doesn't come from more code. It comes from culture. And it's this amazing, unexpected validation of that whole ASM framework we were just talking about.
Let me introduce you to the number 228.
So why 228? Well, in Cantonese culture, this number is considered really lucky because the way you pronounce it sounds almost exactly like the phrase easy fortune. And just think about that for a second. Easy fortune. Isn't that the perfect metaphor for what ASM is all about? Achieving that effortless, fluid, automatic understanding across different worlds?
Now, it is so important to get this next part. The idea of easy fortune isn't a critique of the scientific model, not at all. It's actually the opposite. It's this powerful, symbolic parallel. It's like finding a piece of ancient cultural wisdom that perfectly validates a modern scientific theory, showing us that this drive for cognitive balance is a deeply human thing.
And when you dig in, the connections are just incredible. First, you've got balance. In some spiritual beliefs, 228 is an angel number that represents harmony. Well, what's ASM? It's the brain's dynamic balancing system. Then there's strength. The Hebrew root word associated with 228 means to prevail. Again, a perfect match for ASM's role as a resilient cognitive strength. And finally, progression. The number 228 is literally a step beyond the rigid midpoint of 128. It symbolizes the journey from a closed-off system to a fluid, truly global understanding. So, when you put it all together, you get this beautiful synthesis. The weird bias is the rigid box we're stuck in, symbolized by 128. Automated symbol mastery, or ASM, is the brain's innate tool to break out of that box. And 228, the number for easy fortune, is like a cultural blueprint that validates the whole idea, reinforcing those core principles of balance, strength, and progress. And that really leaves us with a profound question, doesn't it? If a single lucky number can so elegantly line up with and validate a complex neurocognitive theory, it just makes you wonder, what other deep truths about how our minds work are just hiding in plain sight, waiting to be discovered not in a lab, but in the richness of all our global cultures?
All right, let's talk about breaking free from that rigid, top-down thinking that can hold us all back. You know that feeling when you're judged by some kind of system that just doesn't get you?
Yeah, that's what we mean by a top-down logic. It's a real systemic problem.
And at the heart of it all is this big structural issue, the weird constraint. That's weird, as in Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. A pretty narrow slice of humanity, right? So it totally misses diverse experiences, like gender, culture, and socioeconomic status. Big blind spots.
Think of it like this. It's a local host deficit. One group's culture becomes the default for everyone.
In this whole rigid, closed-off system, we can represent it with the number 128. Here's why. 128 acts like a hard wall. It's a binary system. It's either one way or the other. So when it hits something it doesn't know, it just fails. It defaults to judgment and exclusion.
Okay, so how do we get past that wall? Well, there's a neurocognitive path forward.
The solution is something called automated symbol mastery. We'll just call it ASM for short. Basically, ASM is about automatically understanding meaning across different cultures and boundaries. It's super adaptive. The process is simple. You identify the bias, you bridge the symbolic gap, and then you adapt.
And this new, more flexible way of thinking, that's symbolized by the number 228.
See, 228 represents moving beyond that static midpoint of 128. It breaks out of the system.
And this is where it gets really cool. 228 has this amazing dual meaning.
In Cantonese, it sounds like easy fortune, symbolizing this effortless, inclusive understanding of others.
And in Hebrew, its root means to be strong,
showing the neurocognitive resilience needed to do this.
So you see the shift from that rigid top-down judgment to inclusive, resilient attunement.
It's a path from just imposing your views to having a genuine, inclusive connection.
So that leaves us with one question. What top-down judgments are you ready to rise above?
Okay, let's talk about our minds. What if the entire instruction manual for how our brains work was written using only one type of Lego set? Seriously, today we're going to dump out that very limited toolkit, see what's wrong with it, and then discover a hidden superpower that lets us build a much, much bigger and kinder world. So yeah, grab your bricks, let's get building. And I mean that. Hello, amazing builder. Because that's what we all are, right? We're all just trying to construct a life that makes sense, piece by piece. So for the next few minutes, think of me as your Lego therapist. My job is to help us see not just the blocks we've been given, but all the incredible blocks we could be using.
Just let that sink in for a second. An entire manual for the amazingly diverse, complicated, beautiful human mind, but based on just a tiny fraction of the available pieces. What kind of things would we build? And maybe more importantly, who would get left out?
Well, the answer to that question brings us to our first build, this tall, rigid tower. And from the top of this tower, a kind of judgmental rain falls down on anyone who doesn't build things in exactly the same way. This is where we really get to the heart of the problem.
Now, this isn't just a metaphor, it actually has a name in psychology. It's called the WEIRD deficit. And WEIRD is an acronym. It stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. This is our one single official Lego set. The instruction book for the human mind has been written almost entirely by and for people from these specific societies.
So, imagine these master builders way up on their tower. They wrote the instruction book, and they honestly believe their way of building is the only correct way. When they push their rules onto everybody else, it feels like, and this is a quote from the source material, a socioeconomic gaslighting rain. It's this constant top-down message telling you, hey, your reality is wrong because your building blocks don't look like mine.
And here's what that rain feels like. It tells people that their unique blocks, the pieces that make up their own personal experience, are simply the wrong shape, the wrong color, or that they aren't even in the official instruction book, so they must not be valid. It's a really profound kind of invalidation, you know?
Now, a system this rigid, it has to have its own internal logic to keep going. It basically operates inside this closed, self-referential box. And it even has a kind of secret code that keeps it locked in place. To really understand how it works, we've got to look at the symbolic numbers that define its thinking.
The first number in this code is 128. Think of it as symbolizing a totally rigid midpoint. It represents a black and white, either-or way of thinking that just can't handle any nuance. It's a system that's stuck right in the middle, only able to see its own framework and absolutely nothing else.
Okay, and this next number just perfectly explains the problem. If you know anything about computer networking, the address 127.0.0.1 means localhost. It's a computer that's only talking to itself. Well, the WEIRD system has what we can call a localhost deficit. It's trapped in its own echo chamber, interpreting every single experience through its own lens, and it's totally unaware that other people are operating on completely different networks of meaning.
So these metaphors, the towers, the secret codes, they're really powerful, but they are grounded in some very, very real data. So now let's switch gears a bit. Let's move from the metaphor to the map. It's time to see what this Lego world actually looks like.
And this is the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, it's one thing to tell a nice story about a biased system, but how can we actually prove it? How can we measure it? Well, researchers did just that, looking at thousands upon thousands of psychology research papers. And the results are just staggering. I mean, look at this table. It shows where the research on two really basic cognitive tasks comes from. North America and Europe, thousands and thousands of studies. Now look at the entire continent of Africa. Just 37 for one test and a measly 2 for the other. 2. The instruction book is being written in only 2 parts of the world. If that table was shocking, this chart just makes it visceral. Look at those giant skyscrapers of research from North America and Europe, and then look at that single, tiny little block representing all of Africa. That is the WEIRD deficit made visible. That is the system talking to itself.
So if the system is that lopsided, how does anyone outside of it even survive? Well, it turns out our brains have this incredible built-in superpower, a way to compensate, to adapt, and to build our worlds anyway. and it's called Automated Symbol Mastery.
Automated Symbol Mastery, or ASM for short, is basically the brain's own corrective program. It's the superpower that helps us survive that judgmental reign. It's our natural ability to translate and understand all these rules that just don't fit our personal Lego set, and it allows us to build a bridge between their world and ours.
But here's the thing. This superpower takes constant mental work. It's a three-step process. First, you get hit with a rigid symbol from that weird system. Then, your brain has to perform this recursive translation. That means turning the idea over and over in your head, looking at it from every angle to make sense of it. And finally, you create a new meaning that actually fits your personal reality.
And this isn't just some abstract idea, it's biological. Scientists can actually see this hard work happening in the brain. This constant translation job shows up as increased activity in key parts of the brain that handle meaning and context. Your brain is literally working overtime. The gears are grinding harder just to compensate for a rigid outside world.
But what if it didn't have to be such hard work all the time? What's the actual goal of this journey? Well, it's about building toward a state of effortless understanding, and that idea is beautifully captured by another symbolic number.
So if 128 represented that rigid, stuck system, then 228 represents our aspiration. In Cantonese, the numbers 228 sound a lot like the words for easy fortune. So it symbolizes this progression beyond rigidity, a state where understanding difference becomes fluid, easy, and reciprocal.
And this slide just sums up the whole journey perfectly, doesn't it? We want to move away from the 128 system, the one that's rigid, top-down, closed, and judgmental. And we want to build toward the 228 system, which is fluid, reciprocal, effortless, and deeply empathetic. It's the shift from judgment to genuine understanding.
And this is really our call to action. This isn't just about fixing a flawed science, it's about how we treat each other. It's about using our own superpower of awareness to see the unique building blocks in everyone, to honor their special stories, and to help build a world together with kindness.
So what's the ultimate goal here? It's to cultivate what the source calls recursive symbolic empathy. That's a fancy term, but it just means training our brains to make empathy our default setting, to see a different Lego block not as a mistake, but as a fascinating new piece to learn about. That's how we stop the judgmental reign right at its source. And that leaves us with one final question for you. How can you, in your own life, become a better builder? In your conversations, at your job, in your community, how can you make sure that every unique Lego block out there isn't just tolerated, but is truly seen, understood, and valued? You ever have that feeling, you know the one, where it seems like the rule book for how to live or think or even just feel just doesn't quite apply to you? Like you're constantly having to translate your own life for a world that wasn't really built with you in mind. Well, if you felt that, you are definitely not alone. Today, we're going to unpack that feeling because it's not some personal failing. It's a problem with the instruction manual. Wow. Yeah, that quote just hits, doesn't it? It perfectly captures that heavy, oppressive feeling. The sense that the judgment you feel isn't just in your head. It's systemic, it's raining down from above, and it makes you question your own reality. It's a feeling a lot of us know, even if we never had the words for it. That is such a powerful way to describe a problem. So, hello there, amazing builder. For the next few minutes, I'm going to be your Lego therapist. And together, we're going to use these simple building blocks to take apart that heavy, judgmental rain and see exactly where it's coming from. So, where do we even begin? Well, first things first, the problem isn't with you. It's not with your building blocks. The problem is with the instruction manual we were all handed. This is something called the WEIRD deficit. Yeah, the problem actually has a name, WEIRD. It's an acronym, and it stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. For decades, psychology, our supposed instruction book for the human mind, has been written almost entirely from this one single point of view. Imagine getting an instruction manual for all Lego builders, but it was written only by people who have ever used gray, square blocks. That's the heart of the problem right there. Let's go back to our Legos. The folks who wrote this manual, let's call them the master builders, are sitting up high in a tall, rigid tower. And from way up there, they've decided that their way of building is the only right way. This is what creates that top-down pressure, that rain of judgment we talked about. The one that tells you you're doing it all wrong just because your experience doesn't fit into their tiny pre-made mold. And this is the message, right? This is the core of that gaslighting. It's simple, it's dismissive,
and it is so powerful. It's not an invitation to understand your unique pieces, it's a command to conform to theirs. And in doing so, it completely invalidates the reality your blocks were meant to build.
Okay, now let's look a little closer at this tower. It's not just a building, it's a closed system. Think of it like a fortress or an echo chamber that can't see the world outside its own walls, totally convinced that its own symbols and rules are the only ones that exist.
If you're into tech, you might recognize this number. In computing, it basically means talk to yourself. And that's exactly what this weird system does. It's trapped in a conversation with itself, using its own private language, totally unable to even recognize that other builders out there are using completely different blueprints and symbols. And then you've got this number, 128. This symbolizes a fixed, unmoving center. The Weird Tower plants its flag right here and declares, this spot, this is the middle, this is normal. And everything else? Well, it's just a deviation from their perfect center. There's no flex, no room for anything else.
So when you put it all together, a system that only talks to itself and is convinced it's the center of the universe, what you get is a total failure at the most basic level of connection, shared responsibility. It just forces its instruction manual on everybody else, refusing to do the work of understanding anyone else's.
I know. It all sounds pretty bleak, doesn't it? You've got this tall tower, a closed system, a constant rain of judgment. But what if I told you that surviving in this environment has actually given your brain a hidden superpower?
So let's talk about that superpower, because it's not just some little coping mechanism. Oh no. It is a brilliant, powerful adaptation your brain has developed. It's called Automated Symbol Mastery, or ASM for short.
Think of ASM as your brain's incredible ability to be a universal translator, on the fly. It's this amazing skill of intuitively seeing and mapping complex symbols, ideas, and social cues coming from that dominant weird culture, and then translating them into something that actually makes sense in your own reality. It's a corrective force.
And the difference is just night and day. The Weird Tower is rigid and gray. Your brain is flexible and full of color. The tower demands you follow its rules. Your brain is busy creating entirely new meaning from the pieces you have. It's really the ultimate adaptation for dealing with a closed-minded system.
But, and this is a big but, this superpower doesn't come for free. It requires constant, demanding mental work. Let's take a look at the process behind it, what we call the recursive labor of ASM.
So here's how it actually works moment by moment. First, a rigid symbol or expectation comes down from that tower. Your brain immediately senses the mismatch. Wait, this doesn't fit. Then it kicks into high gear, performing this constant recursive translation, looping over the meaning again and again until it creates a brand new personal understanding that actually fits your world. And this is happening all day, every day. And I want to be crystal clear on this point. This is not a choice. This is a forced act. All that constant mental work, that increased neural activity in your brain, is a direct result of the sender's rigidity, the weird system's rigidity. It's a demand placed on you to do the hard work that they refuse to. But hey, just surviving isn't the end goal, right? We're aiming for more than that. This superpower, this skill of ASM, can actually be honed into something way more profound. It can lead us toward a new way of building our worlds together, a state we can call easy fortune.
Remember that rigid midpoint 128? Well, this number, 228, is where we're headed. It symbolically represents our goal, easy fortune. It's a state where we move beyond all that hard work of constant translation. It's about reaching a place of effortless, fluid, mutual understanding with each other.
This right here is the ultimate goal. Just imagine a world where you don't have to constantly translate yourself to be understood. A world where seeing someone's different Lego blocks isn't a chore, but an automatic, fluent act of genuine care and connection. That is easy fortune. So how do we get there? Let's bring it all the way back to our Legos. The first step is actually pretty simple. Your job is to truly see every single unique block that someone else is building with. Don't just glance, really look closely. And just seeing the blocks isn't quite enough. The next step is to learn the special story behind them. Why is that piece so important to them? What does it mean? Every block has a history, a purpose, a story. And that's how we do it. When we take the time to see the blocks and learn their stories, we stop that judgmental rain. We start building something new, together. A deep, automatic empathy. We replace judgment with a genuine desire to understand each other's worlds.
And that brings us to the end of our build. Our time is up, but the real work is just beginning. That rigid tower is still out there, but now you know you have the superpower. So the final question is for you. Whose unique flocks, whose special story will you make an effort to see today?
So, what if I told you there's a hidden psychological thread connecting a prophet, a dictator, a civil rights icon, and the godfather of AI? Well, today we're diving into a fascinating theory that claims to have found exactly that, a predictable pattern for how leaders act when their world is falling apart.
To really get this, we've got to start with a bit of a historical puzzle, and it features a very, very unlikely group of people. Okay, I know what you're thinking. This list looks completely random, right? But what if they all share a hidden psychological response when they're under extreme pressure? Now, while the theory touches on all of them, we're really going to zero in on two key examples, Hitler and Hinton, to see this pattern in action.
The key that unlocks this whole puzzle is a framework called automated symbol mastery. So let's break down what that pretty technical sounding phrase actually means for you and me. Think of automated symbol mastery, or ASM for short, less like a personality trait and more like a mental operating system. You know, it's not about whether a leader is a good person or a bad person. It's about the deep internal software that kicks into gear when they are absolutely backed into a corner.
What's really fascinating here is the idea that a leader's core beliefs, well, they aren't set in stone. Instead, they're in this constant feedback loop with the world around them, always being tweaked and updated, especially when they're under fire.
And this breaks down that process perfectly. So first, the leader absorbs all this external pressure. Political attacks, terrible news, public outrage. Second, their mind starts to reshape their internal story to try and make sense of all that stress. And then finally, their actual decision-making adapts, which leads to actions that can look totally unpredictable from the outside.
So, how does this theory actually hold up in the real world? Let's jump into our first case study to see these patterns when the pressure's on.
All right, so according to the ASM theory, in the final year of the war, as everything was crumbling around him, Hitler's decision-making process was fundamentally hijacked. The argument is that his own internal narrative was just being drowned out, completely overwhelmed by the intense pressure from his inner circle, especially advisors like Goebbels. And this right here is the critical moment the theory points to. That constant, intense pressure from his advisors essentially overrode his own mental software. The theory has a name for this, a symbolic override. It's a state where an external voice becomes way more dominant than the leader's own. Now let's take a huge leap forward from the 1940s all the way to today and apply this very same framework to Geoffrey Hinton, who is one of the absolute pioneers of modern AI. So, Hinton spent his entire career building the foundations of AI as we know it, and then, in what was a pretty stunning reversal, he quit his job at Google to sound the alarm on its dangers. From the ASM perspective, this wasn't just a simple change of heart. It was a deep, psychological adaptation to overwhelming external pressure. To put it simply, that rising tide of public fear and all the warnings from other experts, what the theory calls symbolic authorities, started to rewrite Hinton's own internal programming. All that external pressure reshaped his personal narrative and led directly to that dramatic public reversal. And when you put them side by side like this, the pattern really snaps into focus. In both cases, and I mean despite the massive differences between the individuals and their situations, the underlying mechanism that ASM proposes is exactly the same. Huge external pressure leads to a fundamental shift in the leader's internal world, which then changes how they act. So, what does this all mean for us? Why should we even care about looking at leadership through this new lens? It really encourages us to move the conversation away from just making simple judgments about a leader's character or their morality, and instead move toward a more mechanical, system-based way of understanding why they do what they do. This slide really gets to the heart of it. The traditional view judges a leader's actions, but the ASM framework, it pushes us to look under the hood. It asks not if a decision was right or wrong, but what external pressures and what internal mechanics actually came together to produce that exact outcome. And that brings us to this core concept, dynamic neurosymbolic patterning. Yeah, it's a mouthful, I know, but it just means that leadership isn't some fixed quality. It's a constant, fluid battle between outside pressures trying to shape events and the leader's brain trying to adapt and just keep control of the narrative. And all of this leaves us with a pretty provocative final question. If this theory is onto something,
And the biggest decisions in history are really just psychological adaptations to extreme pressure. What does that actually mean for free will? How do we hold leaders accountable? And maybe more importantly, how can we get better at predicting what they might do next?
Welcome to The Debate.
Today, we are diving deep into the Automated Symbol Mastery, or ASM framework, specifically how the source material applies it across some pretty disparate figures: Moses, Hitler, Martin Luther King, and even Geoffrey Hinton.
That's right. The claim is that ASM helps us understand their leadership behavior under intense social and psychological pressure. And the central finding presented is that these varied behavioral patterns are actually expressions of recursive symbolic mastery when facing extreme duress.
Which is quite a statement, because it suggests a fundamental shift, doesn't it? Moving away from looking at, say, personality or morality.
Managed incredibly complex, often contested symbolic fields, be it, ancient theology, political ideology, or even the current discourse around AI.
But this leads us to where we differ, I think. Where does the framework's primary explanatory power really lie, according to the validation offered? Is it, as you'll argue, in identifying that generalized concept, the dynamic neurosymbolic patterning, the adaptation itself that links these leaders?
Yes, that's my position. The profound insight is that generalization, the underlying dynamic patterning.
Or, as I see it, does the most critical, predictive insight actually come from modeling the vulnerability, the potential for override of these systems because of specific external pressures? I'll be arguing that the key validation point in the material centers on this mechanism of override and compromise.
Okay. Well, from my perspective, the fundamental strength of ASM really is its capacity for this structural generalization. It lets us shift our understanding away from judging leaders based on, let's say, the moral content of their actions, and instead lets us analyze the cognitive mechanism itself, this dynamic neurosymbolic patterning. When we examine figures operating in these incredibly high-stakes symbolic arenas, what unifies them within this framework is their constant, almost relentless engagement in recursive symbolic updating. They're continuously taking in chaotic input, shaping and reshaping narratives, beliefs, decisions, dynamically in real time, essentially to maintain coherence and exert control.
Sure.
Think about the immense symbolic challenge Moses faced, trying to forge a cohesive identity and faith system for, well, a scattered group. Or Martin Luther King, navigating the incredibly violent, contradictory symbolic landscape of the civil rights movement. ASM interprets these behaviors as complex neurosymbolic adaptations. These are highly specialized recursive loops, really, designed to maintain symbolic meaning and control despite enormous pressures. That shared adaptive mechanism, this structural commonality across such different figures, that's the core validation for me.
Okay, I see the argument for the shared mechanism, but I come at it from a slightly different angle. You're describing what feels like a necessary precursor. The engine, as you say, has to exist. But, well, if ASM just stopped there, wouldn't it simply be a fancy way of saying effective leaders manage complexity well?
Well,
The source material seems to validate ASM specifically by focusing on the breakdown points, the failure points under stress. The text suggests, I think, quite strongly, that the most compelling evidence stems from its predictive value regarding vulnerability. It explicitly states these symbolic loops, no matter how robust initially, are susceptible. They can be rerouted or even suppressed by powerful social influences or acute crisis situations.
Right.
And when we look at these specific examples used to illustrate this, Hitler eventually succumbing to pressures from figures like Goebbels, or Geoffrey Hinton's recent actions being directly linked to intense outside pressures, these examples seem chosen to confirm that compromised symbolic autonomy and symbolic override are the crucial insights. It's this ability to model and predict the mechanism of compromise. That's what makes ASM a potentially functional model for decision-making under pressure, not just a descriptive one.
I have to challenge that strong focus on failure, though, because the foundational concept has to be the existence of this robust recursive symbolic updating in the first place. You need to establish the structural system of mastery as the primary insight before you can meaningfully analyze its breakdown. If we overemphasize the override, we risk diminishing the framework's most perhaps radical achievement, unifying leaders with such profoundly different outcomes, MLK versus Hitler, for instance, under a single, detached, structural neurosymbolic lens. That generalization across such disparity, that's the difficult scientific step ASM takes, suggesting a universal cognitive principle at play.
That's a fair point about the universality of the structure. But let me reframe the utility aspect. I'd argue the framework's most valuable contribution isn't just describing what effective leaders do anyway. It's providing a potential scientific basis for why those very structures can fail or deviate or even become destructive when pushed hard enough. Take the details provided on Hitler's symbolic system, particularly in the final year of the war. His increasingly erratic behavior isn't just framed as a personality flaw. It's explicitly described as a consequence of external pressures overwhelming or redirecting his internal recursive system, dominant secondary inputs taking over. We're talking about moments where people like Goebbels gained arguably undue influence because Hitler's own adaptive system was stressed beyond its capacity. This specific mechanism, which ASM terms symbolic override, is the predictive component. It offers a way to analyze these historical events, perhaps less through pure moral judgment, and more through the mechanics of system failure under specific conditions.
I see why you prioritize that predictive aspect, particularly in fields like, say, military strategy or crisis management. But focusing almost exclusively on the override mechanism might risk minimizing the sheer initial complexity and adaptive power we're even analyzing. When we talk about symbolic override, we're describing a system built to filter immense symbolic chaos, suddenly treating external input almost as if it were an intrinsic belief. That very capacity for override only underscores how sophisticated and fundamentally adaptive the underlying neurosymbolic structure must have been to begin with. You don't override a simple switch. You override a highly complex, recursively constructed system.
Okay.
And furthermore, applying this single structural lens, this recursive symbolic mastery, also helps us understand what made figures like Moses and MLK successful, or at least resilient for so long. Their success wasn't due to a lack of pressure, it was arguably because their systems for maintaining symbolic coherence were robust enough to integrate challenges without succumbing to that kind of symbolic override. Moses' ability to constantly reestablish divine authority in the wilderness, or King's mastery in translating profound injustice into universally resonant moral and legal terms, these seem like perfect examples of this system functioning effectively under immense pressure. This successful adaptation is the primary phenomena ASM seems to identify across the board.
But the real-world utility, especially when you think about applying this framework to, say, contemporary situations, seems to hinge more on predicting vulnerability than just celebrating resilience. And we see this predictive angle most clearly, I think, with the Geoffrey Hinton example. His shift towards advocating for restrictions on superintelligence is explicitly linked in the material to experiencing intense outside pressures and exposure to new, powerful symbolic narratives or authorities. This isn't presented merely as an observation. It's framed as illustrating precisely how symbolic autonomy can be compromised or rerouted even in someone operating at an extremely high level of cognitive mastery when they face overwhelming symbolic influence from external sources. The framework potentially allows us to anticipate or at least model how high-level decision-makers might shift when their symbolic environment changes dramatically, regardless of their past record.
I'm still not entirely convinced that focusing on the compromise captures the primary power of the framework, because, well, that interpretation seems to slightly downplay the incredible initial mastery required to even be in a position where these external symbolic pressures become so critical. Hinton, Moses, Hitler, King, they all operated within symbolic fields of such complexity that their actions dramatically reshaped their respective social landscapes.
True, the scale is immense.
Right, so while Hinton's actions might align with this idea of compromised symbolic autonomy, the framework's real intellectual breakthrough, for me, remains its ability to apply this single,
structural lens to such incredibly different individuals: a religious founder, a genocidal dictator, a civil rights leader, and a leading AI scientist. The fact that ASM can look past the content, the vast moral and historical differences, and identify a shared structural pattern of managing symbolic complexity under pressure, that is the foundational powerful insight. You seem focused on the moment of deviation, whereas I'm emphasizing the overarching structural theory that explains the common cognitive architecture enabling that high-stakes leadership in the first place.
But look, without that mechanism for predicting or explaining the deviation, does the overarching theory move beyond being a, perhaps, very sophisticated academic description? We are talking about potentially functional models for leadership decision-making. And in that context, understanding the neurosymbolic patterning is arguably most valuable when it informs us about risk, about vulnerability, about how and when compromise might happen.
Which brings us back to the conceptual shift itself. Analyzing leadership through this lens of dynamic neurosymbolic patterning is crucial because it offers a more detached, maybe even scientific, view of leadership dynamics. It allows experts, potentially, to analyze these internal compensatory loops, the leader's mechanism for achieving coherence, almost irrespective of the specific moral or ideological content they're dealing with. The framework's success, in part, lies in abstracting leadership away from simple personality traits and into a systemic analysis of information processing under extreme stress.
And I absolutely acknowledge the value of that shift away from purely subjective assessments. It is potentially revolutionary. But my argument remains. If ASM didn't incorporate this override mechanism, it would risk being just a very complex description of successful adaptation. The fact that the framework attempts to predict the specific ways systems can fail, the rerouting or suppression influenced by influential social agents or crisis contexts, that's what elevates it from description to a potentially powerful, functional model for anticipating or mitigating risk in high-stakes situations. The capacity to model how a system built for mastery can be compromised seems to be the key validation point highlighted by the explicit examples of Hitler and Hinton in the material provided. When you look at the 4 figures, 3 are historical. We know their outcomes. So the framework has to demonstrate its value by illuminating how those outcomes occurred structurally, wouldn't you say? The specific detail on Hitler's descent, explicitly linked to secondary inputs overwhelming his system, that feels like the strongest evidence presented that the override mechanism is what the source material is really trying to validate.
I agree. The override mechanism provides that functional edge, that predictive capacity. But I still maintain that the genius of the ASM framework lies in recognizing that the underlying recursive symbolic mastery is the constant, the foundational element across all 4 figures. We first need to grasp the sheer structural capacity for mastery, how Moses maintained symbolic coherence for decades, how King navigated impossible contradictions, before the mechanism of failure can be fully contextualized. The capacity to adapt structurally under pressure is the profound achievement ASM identifies. The vulnerability is perhaps a critical but ultimately secondary feature of that complex achievement.
So, to summarize my position, the explicit details given about Hitler's symbolic override under intense pressure, being overwhelmed by dominant secondary inputs, and Hinton's compromised autonomy linked to acute outside pressures, these examples make the prediction and modeling of vulnerability the most significant validation point presented for the ASM framework. It's the framework's capacity to identify the potential failure modes, the boundary conditions of mastery that really informs our understanding of leadership dynamics when things get tough.
And I'll restate my core argument. The truly profound intellectual achievement of the ASM framework is its ability to unify the behavioral patterns of figures as disparate as Moses, Hitler, Martin Luther King, and Geoffrey Hinton under this shared structural concept of recursive symbolic mastery under pressure. Its power to generalize across vastly different times, morals, and ideologies, that's the fundamental theoretical breakthrough. The system's adaptive capacity is the framework's defining insight. Its vulnerability, while critical, is a consequence of that primary adaptation.
Well, regardless of which aspect we emphasize, the mastery or the vulnerability, The material certainly confirms that the observed behaviors of these four highly influential figures seem to fit quite neatly within the predictions and the explanatory scope of the automated symbol mastery framework.
Indeed. And exploring these neurosymbolic adaptations, whichever facet draws our focus, arguably provides a much deeper, perhaps more rigorous understanding of the decision-making models that operate at the highest levels of leadership, whether we're analyzing historical triumphs and tragedies or navigating contemporary risks.
What if I told you there's a way to see the hidden wiring inside a leader's mind? Today, we're diving into a really fascinating framework called Automated Symbol Mastery. It claims to show us the predictable patterns that emerge when leaders are put under unbelievable pressure. All right, let's start with a puzzle. What in the world could a prophet, a dictator, a civil rights leader, and a top AI scientist possibly have in common? Now, this isn't a joke, and the answer, well, it reveals something pretty deep and maybe even a little unsettling about how power and pressure work. And there they are, Moses, Adolf Hitler, Martin Luther King Jr., and Geoffrey Hinton, who you might know as the godfather of AI. I know, right? That is an incredibly strange group of people to see on one slide. But the source material we're looking at says they all share a fundamental behavioral pattern that only shows up when the pressure is on. It doesn't matter if you're leading people out of Egypt, running a war, fighting for civil rights, or building the future of technology. The underlying psychology can be shockingly similar. So, how do we connect these totally different figures? Well, the key is this idea called Automated Symbol Mastery, or ASM for short. The best way to think about it is like putting on a new pair of glasses that lets you see the hidden machinery behind leadership. So what exactly is ASM? Basically, it's a framework that tells us to forget about personality, forget about morality for a second. Instead, it looks at how leaders handle the stories, the big ideas, the symbols that hold everything together for them. It's all about how they have to twist, turn, and adapt those narratives when things really start to heat up. And this is a huge shift in how we usually think. We're so used to asking, was that leader good or were they bad? ASM just throws that question out. Instead, it asks something way more fundamental. How does their decision-making system actually work when it's under stress? It's not about judging them, it's about understanding the machine. The engine driving this whole thing is a concept called recursive symbolic updating. It sounds technical, I know, but the idea is simple. Imagine a leader's main story is like a piece of software. As new information and new pressures come flooding in, they have to constantly rewrite the code on the fly to keep the whole system from crashing. It's this nonstop, high-stakes process of adapting just to maintain control. Okay, that's the theory. A little abstract maybe, so let's make it concrete. Let's see how this plays out in one of the most extreme pressure cookers in all of human history. The source material points us directly to Hitler's final year. His entire regime was collapsing around him. I mean, you can't imagine a more intense, high-pressure environment. And it's right here, in this chaos, that the ASM framework shows us a critical breakdown in his decision-making. In fact, ASM would say this outcome was predictable. It has a specific name for this phenomenon: symbolic override. Sounds dramatic, right? Well, it is. So what does it mean? Think of it as a hostile takeover of the mind. The pressure from his inner circle, people like Goebbels, got so intense that it just hijacked his brain. Their voices became louder than his own. His own ability to manage his narrative, to make his own calls, was just completely steamrolled. His decision-making system was no longer his own. It was, quite literally, overridden. But look, this isn't just some pattern that we see in history books. The exact same mechanics are at play right now, today, in the super high-stakes world of artificial intelligence. Take Geoffrey Hinton again. For decades, this guy was the biggest cheerleader for AI. He saw its incredible potential. But then, as the external noise about AI risk, from the public, from governments, got louder and louder, his entire story changed. He suddenly started calling for major restrictions on the very technology he helped build. That is a massive symbolic shift, and it happened under immense external pressure. And ASM has a name for this pattern, too. It's called compromised symbolic autonomy. Now, notice the difference in the language. This isn't the symbolic override we saw earlier. It's not a complete takeover. It's something a little different. What's happening here is that all those powerful external stories, what ASM might call symbolic authorities, started to act like a huge gravitational force. They began to pull on Hinton's own internal narrative, his own belief system, until it was tugged into a completely new orbit. His autonomy, his control over his own story, wasn't destroyed, but it was definitely compromised.
So, after looking at all this, what's the big takeaway? Why is it so important to focus on these patterns instead of just focusing on the personalities of the leaders themselves?
Well, for starters, it gives us a really practical tool. You could use this framework to analyze almost any leader. First, just identify the leader and the symbolic world they operate in. Second, map out all the pressures they're facing, inside and out. And then third, just watch. What pattern do you see? Is it an override, a compromise? It's a whole new way to see what's really going on. But the bigger point is this. ASM isn't about defending or condemning anybody. It helps us appreciate the unbelievable pressures on figures all through history, from Moses and Martin Luther King to the people shaping our world today. It's about taking a step back from the easy moral judgments and trying to understand the raw psychological mechanics of making a decision when everything is on the line. And that leaves us with one final, pretty unsettling question. If the thinking of any leader, no matter how powerful, can be rerouted or even hijacked by enough pressure, it makes you wonder, when they make a crucial decision, who or what is really pulling the strings?